Molly Jacobs was an unremarkable 15-year-old. The subject was an adolescent girl who exhibited typical hormonal behaviors, including frequent rebelliousness and anger towards her mother. Her mother, Linda, attempted to exert control over her daughter's actions, often stating that her behavior was wrong and providing advice on how she should act. Additionally, the subject did not like her friend and was not fond of the way her friend dressed. In short, Linda was a control freak. Linda did not listen to her daughter and never asked her about her interests or concerns. She also never inquired about her daughter's academic performance or even knew who her daughter's best friends were. Despite her efforts to exert control over her daughter's social interactions, Linda's actions strained their relationship. While Molly recognized her mother's desire for her to have the best, she believed that Linda's definition of the best was not necessarily aligned with her own. Molly's father, Jim, or Jimmy as he was affectionately called, exemplified a different approach. From an early age, he learned to avoid getting caught up in trivial matters. He encouraged Molly to embrace her individuality, allowing her to chart her own course in life. As long as she did not harm herself or others, she was free to make her own choices. These included avoiding drugs, refraining from sexual activity, abstaining from bullying, and telling the truth. If she wanted blue hair, Jimmy would encourage her to do so. If she wanted to pierce her nose, he would sign the necessary permission slip. While he was gentle, he had two clear rules: do not lie and be faithful. He advised Molly to express her feelings, speak directly, and avoid secrets. He told her that secrets can have a damaging effect on one's personality and life. Over time, secrets can become unmanageable. If secrets are not addressed, they can cause significant damage over time. Jimmy's other rule, fidelity, was based on the principles of loyalty and honesty towards family, friends, and oneself. It entailed upholding moral and ethical standards, providing guidance and support to friends, and encouraging them to make informed decisions. Jimmy's reputation as a copyright lawyer was built on these traits. He was a partner in a prominent law firm. He was a partner in a high-tech copyright law firm, yet he always made time to watch Molly's soccer and softball games, as well as any school events in which she was involved. He consistently made time to walk, bike, fish, kayak, and camp with her because he was aware that she was maturing rapidly and that she would soon no longer be able to engage in these activities with him. Linda occasionally participated in these activities, but typically declined to do so. As a result, Molly and her father developed an exceptionally close bond. Linda expressed feelings of envy towards this relationship. Every Wednesday, Linda had the day off. She informed Jimmy and Molly that she would utilize this time to engage in cooking, catch up on housework, go shopping, and potentially visit her mother and father on Wednesdays. Upon Molly's return home, she would frequently observe Jimmy's older brother, Dan, driving his pickup truck down the street. When she inquired about the whereabouts of Uncle Dan, Linda would occasionally respond that he was not visiting, which struck her as peculiar given that his vehicle was often seen parked on their block. On occasion, Linda would remark that Dan would occasionally visit to inquire about a landscaping project he was assisting with, to borrow some of Jimmy's tools, or to ascertain whether Jimmy was home so that he could speak with him. Molly perceived these visits as somewhat peculiar, given that Linda was typically present before Molly's school day concluded at 5 o'clock. The time between 3 o'clock and 6 p.m. was reserved for sports practice. The period between 6 o'clock and 9 p.m. was allocated to Jimmy, who arrived at the earliest at 6 o'clock and at the latest at 9 o'clock. On the day in question, shortly after the midday recess, at approximately 12, Molly began experiencing severe cramps due to her menstrual cycle. She requested permission from the teacher to see the nurse and was permitted to leave school. She called her mother, Linda, but the call went to voicemail. She tried again and received the same result. Therefore, she left a brief voicemail message for her mother, stating that she was not feeling well and was leaving school. She informed her mother that she would be walking home, as it was only a short distance of 10 blocks. However, if her mother received the voicemail, she could pick up Molly from school. Molly proceeded to walk home. However, Linda did not contact her. When Molly reached the bend in the street on her block, she observed Uncle Dan's vehicle parked in the driveway. It appeared that he might require additional tools. Molly proceeded to walk up the path, only to find the door locked, which seemed unusual. She then used her keys to unlock the door. The ground floor was dark, quiet, and unoccupied. Molly proceeded to the kitchen, where she deposited her backpack and investigated the garage to ascertain whether Uncle Dan was searching for tools. However, the garage was also devoid of any occupants. Upon returning to the house, Molly heard a series of groans and heavy breathing emanating from upstairs. Intrigued, she proceeded to quietly ascend the stairs and traverse the hallway to her parents' bedroom. Upon catching sight of her mother, Linda, engaged in sexual intercourse with Uncle Dan, Molly was rendered speechless. Dan, they both moaned. She quickly backed away, shocked and in tears. She was unsure of how to respond, but when the anger over her uncle's and her mother's betrayal of Jimmy's father sank into her mind, she became enraged. She looked around again, this time with her phone and video camera on, and observed that Linda and Dan, unaware of her presence, continued their sexual encounter. "You dirty boy, don't stop," she screamed. Dan replied, "I love you. Sex with you and I'll have you better than little Jimmy ever did." They both laughed, which incensed Molly. She entered the room and screamed, "You are cheating. How could you do this to our family?" She then turned to her uncle, Dan, and said, "Your own brother's wife. I hate both of you. You pathetic pieces of, .. Both Dan and Linda looked around, confused that someone was there, and then recoiled in horror. Upon observing Molly filming them and yelling at them, Molly turned and ran down the stairs. Linda screamed, "Oh God, no, Molly. No, please come back. It's not what you think. Please, Molly, come here and talk to me." She then proceeded to run down the hallway after Molly, but Molly was already out the front door before Linda even came down from the top of the stairs. Linda then ran back and shouted to Dan, "Get dressed and start your truck. We have to catch. We must persuade her not to divulge the information. It would devastate Jimmy and could potentially lead to fatal consequences. What have I done?" She suddenly broke down in tears and sobs. Dan urged her to compose herself and get dressed, emphasizing the need to act swiftly. Molly proceeded to traverse the backyard, her phone ringing. It was Linda calling, but she did not respond, and the call was redirected to voicemail. She then made her way to the 9M Creek nature trails. His father traversed these paths on foot, and they had a preferred resting place situated between 5 sizable cottonwood trees. They referred to it as "our trees," and on occasion, they engaged in a race along the trail to determine who could reach it first. Molly positioned herself behind the trees, sat down, rested her head on her knees, and began to weep. She was perplexed by her mother's actions toward her father and herself. She was also perplexed by her uncle's infidelity toward Jimmy. His brother and his wife were also present. She was crying, tears flowing down her cheeks. She continued to ignore her mother's calls. She did not want to talk to her, not now and probably never again. She was desperate. When this happened, she always reached out to her father. By this time, Linda had called Molly many times, but no one answered. She saw and responded to Molly's voicemail, saying she was not feeling well and was leaving school. While Linda was engaged in intimate physical contact with Dan, she ignored the calls, concluding that they were likely from Jimmy and that any interruption would disrupt the experience. She experienced a complex emotional state, comprising guilt, lust, and excitement, which she perceived as a form of illicit pleasure. She had been engaging in this behavior for approximately 10 weeks. Given that she had been engaging in the aforementioned behavior with Dan behind Jimmy's back for approximately 10 weeks, she was aware that it could not continue indefinitely. She was cognizant of the fact that her actions were interfering with her relationship with her family. She was aware that her husband would be adversely affected if he discovered her infidelity, yet she lacked the fortitude to terminate her relationship with Dan. She rationalized that her actions were solely for her own gratification and that they would not negatively impact her husband. She did not appear to allow her actions to impinge upon her marriage. Despite her marriage, she was unaware that it had created an emotional barrier in her relationship with her family. It is likely that her guilt was a contributing factor. If only she could force herself to consider the probable outcome, she would realize how foolish it was to jeopardize everything that held personal significance. She now despised herself for her actions, or perhaps she simply hated the fact that she had been caught. She did not have time she was reluctant to analyze the situation further, as she was afraid that she would have to delve deeper into her motivations to understand why she had taken such a risk. Now that her daughter had called her a derogatory name and run away, she had begun to grasp the potential harm her actions could have on others, including herself. She was perplexed by her inability to prevent this outcome. She loved Jimmy and Molly more than anyone else in the world and was acutely aware of her actions. She was aware that her actions would have a detrimental impact on her marriage, yet she found herself unable to resist the allure of her secret voice. Now, she was consumed by the thought of what might happen to her family and the realization that she had effectively destroyed the men and daughter she loved, thereby destroying herself in the process. In a desperate attempt to salvage the situation, she contacted Molly and attempted to persuade her to confide in her, in order to prevent Jimmy from discovering the truth. Molly perceived that Linda's actions would have a detrimental impact on Jimmy, and thus continued to disregard her calls. Instead, she opted to contact her father, who promptly responded to her call after the second ring. "Hey little rebel, what's going on? Aren't you at school? Are you okay?" Jimmy could hear the distressing sounds of his daughter's tears and sobs. "Molly, what happened? What has happened? Are you injured? Where are you? Where is your mother? Dad, please come quickly. I require your assistance. I am situated in the vicinity of the trees. Do not inform your mother of my whereabouts or respond to her communications until you have reached me. Molly, I am compelled to inquire as to the nature of your recent altercation with Linda. Are you unharmed? I am uncertain as to the circumstances surrounding this incident. I implore you, Jimmy, to hasten your arrival. I am presently unharmed, but I require your presence. I will be fine, but I require your assistance immediately. Please take care of yourself and remain stationary. I will arrive within 20 minutes. Jimmy abruptly departed from his office, disinclined to elaborate on the situation with Beth. He simply informed her that a client had experienced a nervous breakdown. Therefore, we must proceed with our activities tomorrow. I will inform you of the details. He exited the building and proceeded to his vehicle. His mobile phone rang once more, and he observed that the caller was Linda. He did not respond, as he had promised Molly that he would not. He allowed the call to be redirected to his voicemail. He started the Porsche and drove out of the parking lot, traversing the distance across town. He arrived at the parking lot, exited the vehicle, and proceeded on foot. He encountered a small fence of trees and observed Molly, who was curled up in a ball and crying. He approached her and inquired about the circumstances surrounding her distress. She threw herself into his arms, embraced him, and wept even more intensely, her entire body trembling with sobs. He stroked her hair and back, and after approximately 3 to 4 minutes, she became visibly calmer. "Molly, did someone offend you? What has happened? Did you and your mother quarrel?" There was a call from Linda on Molly's phone. There were already 10 missed calls from Linda on Molly's phone. His phone rang, and it was Linda again. He was about to answer, but Molly interjected, stating, "Don't answer. We need to talk, Dad. I don't know what to do." He had always instructed her to adhere to the principles of veracity and familial fidelity, emphasizing the importance of divulging information rather than concealing it. However, there were instances where the truth could be more detrimental than beneficial. In such cases, it might be necessary to confront the truth, even if it could potentially lead to distress. Molly's emotional state was evident, and she seemed to be grappling with a significant burden. It was crucial to acknowledge the reality of the situation and provide support and guidance to help her cope. "Dad, I can see that you are distressed. It might be helpful to address the underlying issues and share the truth with those who can provide assistance. Did your mother contact you recently? If so, was it through a voicemail? Let's listen to it together." Jimmy regarded her with a peculiar expression. Jimmy then proceeded to open the phone and access Linda's voicemail. "Jimmy, I require your assistance. Molly and I have engaged in a heated discussion, resulting in her abrupt departure. She is visibly distressed, yet I am uncertain as to the specific nature of the incident that has caused her such distress. I am currently searching for her. Could you kindly contact me and provide me with her whereabouts, or alternatively, contact her and request that she contact me? Jimmy, I wish to reiterate that I hold only you and Molly in the highest regard and will always do so." The abrupt conclusion of the message may have seemed unusual, but Jimmy chose to disregard this and instead focused his attention on Molly. She emitted a sarcastic growl when she heard the message. "Let me play mine," she said, and proceeded to play Linda's first voicemail. In the message, Linda could be heard sobbing as she said, "Molly, it's not what you think. It doesn't mean anything. It's just a harmless and meaningless act." She then implored Molly to call her and discuss the matter before doing something she might regret. She also urged Molly to speak with her before speaking with her father. Jimmy looked at her in confusion and was tempted to ask a question. However, he decided to remain patient. Molly requested that the next voice message from her mother be played. The message began with Linda begging and pleading with Molly, saying, "Please talk to me. Don't tell anyone, especially your father. This will destroy him and our family." Molly was visibly upset and responded with a string of unintelligible words. Jimmy, who was present during this exchange, was completely confused and asked Molly to explain what was going on. At the outset, "Dad, are you certain that Molly informed you of this? It is evident that she has already caused significant distress to our family. Despite this, I believe that you have already formed an opinion." Jimmy regarded her with a gaze that conveyed his disquiet, and said, "Molly, you cannot go to such extremes and withhold this information from me. Let us conclude this matter as soon as possible. I am truly sorry, Dad. I was unwell at school and therefore decided to return home. I called my mother several times, but her phone was switched off. I arrived home and discovered that Uncle Dan's vehicle was parked in the driveway. The front door was locked, so I gained access. I proceeded to enter the residence and discovered that no one was present on the ground floor. I then heard a noise emanating from your bedroom, prompting me to ascend the stairs in a cautious manner. I extend my sincerest apologies to you, your family, and myself. I believe it would be beneficial for us to view the video." She handed the phone to her father, lowered her head to her knees, and began to sob quietly once more. Jimmy activated the video, and the entire harrowing and repugnant scene Molly had witnessed was revealed in full color and sound. It was brief, concluding with Molly's cry of pain. Her words to Linda and Dan abruptly ended their carnal bliss. The expressions on their faces when they saw Molly standing in the doorway were difficult to witness. It was a complex mixture of emotions, including pleasure, shock, fear, shame, guilt, and anger, all occurring in less than 5 seconds. Jimmy turned off the phone, and now his head was bowed to his knees as tears began to fall. He was questioning the divine plan and the nature of evil. How could she do this to them and to his brother? How could they betray him and humiliate him in such a way? He was reluctant to elaborate further. Molly drew closer to him, embraced him around the shoulders, and articulated her sentiments of betrayal and shock. She expressed her desire to avoid future contact with them and to undo the damage they had caused to their family. Linda had contacted the office directly, but the receptionist could only inform her that he had hastily departed to meet with a client and would not be available that day. She suggested that she take a message and contact him at a later time. It is evident that he was aware of his wife's desire to communicate with him. However, Linda declined the opportunity and terminated the call. Consequently, Dan and Linda abandoned the notion of locating Molly while traversing the area in his vehicle. He subsequently returned to the residence and parked in the driveway. The house was devoid of illumination, and Jimmy's vehicle was not present. It was unlikely that Molly would return. "Linda, I am concerned about her potential for impulsive or ill-considered actions. I hope she does not engage in any hasty or misguided conversations with Jimmy. He is unlikely to pardon us for this turn of events. I must conclude this conversation and return home. Amanda is curious about my whereabouts, and I believe I will simply remain silent and observe the situation. It is regrettable that we acted so foolishly." Linda gazed at him and could barely speak through her tears and sobs. "Drop me off, Dan," she said. "I must consider what I will say to Molly. I must reach her before Jimmy discovers our secret. I must persuade her that our relationship is not significant and that if she tells Jimmy about it, our lives will be ruined." I called Molly again, but the phone went to voicemail once more. "Molly," I shouted. Molly, I'm so sorry. Please understand that it didn't mean anything and it's over. Please call me before you talk to anyone. Please don't tell Jimmy, it will destroy us all," with these words. Linda exited the vehicle and returned to the residence. She contacted Molly, aware that there would be no response. She proceeded to the master bedroom, removed the existing bed linens, and replaced them with new ones. This was her customary practice on Wednesdays over the past 10 weeks, following Dan's departure. She sat on the bed and wept. Why had she done this? Why had she risked her marriage and family's respect for this? She reflected that she had not even liked Dan that much. Of course, she had not loved him. Her love for Jimmy had never diminished, but she looked back at her behavior and saw how she had begun to emotionally push both him and her daughter away. Why had she always been so nagging at Molly? When had she stopped talking openly and lying to Jimmy? When was the last time she had made love to him and shown him any meaningful affection? Affection or connection? What is the source of her distress? She reflected on the matter at length. I believe that a significant factor is the excitement and trepidation associated with acting in a manner that is contrary to the expectations of my family. It is a decision that I have made for myself, and while it may be perceived as wrong, it is also part of what makes it so appealing. My life has become rather unfulfilling, and it seems that no one else requires my attention. Molly no longer needed me, and she ended our open and loving relationship. Jimmy did not require any additional concerns, he had everything he needed. He had a demanding legal career that left little time for personal matters. After his wife emotionally distanced herself from him, he recognized the shortcomings of their sex life. However, when he sought Linda's input on the matter and suggested hiring a consultant, she declined, stating that everything was fine. It appeared that Jimmy was no longer emotionally invested in their relationship. Dan, on the other hand, had conveyed to her that she was sexually attractive and that he relied on her. He was unable to derive the same level of comfort and intimacy from his wife, Amanda, as he did from Linda. Given that Amanda was 6 months pregnant with their second child, he did not receive much attention at home. His flirting with Dan and constant comments about her beauty and desirability eventually led to physical contact, which rapidly intensified into a state of intense, all-consuming lust. However, Linda recalled the expression of pain, disgust, and betrayal on Molly's face. Molly had called her a cheap, a sentiment with which Linda strongly concurred. She reflected on various aspects of her life, including her relationship with Amanda, her interactions with Dan and Jimmy, her perception of her parents, and the potential consequences of her actions. She realized that she had caused significant distress to herself and those around her without fully considering the implications of her actions. She experienced a restless sleep, during which she cried persistently. Jimmy and Molly, too, were visibly distressed, engaging in intermittent conversation while standing by the trees. They were uncertain about their future and grappling with a complex emotional state, characterized by feelings of anger and pain. I was wounded by the woman I loved and shared my life with, as well as the older brother with whom I grew up and who I assumed would always have my back. Now, you are also a part of this situation, aware that our family dynamic will never be the same. I am unsure if I can even look at Linda, let alone forgive her, but she is your mother, and maintaining a relationship with her is important. Despite the apparent difficulties, it is recommended that a hotel room be secured for the purpose of rest and recuperation. The following day, a more comprehensive assessment of the situation can be undertaken. It is noted that the aforementioned individuals proceeded to the center and rented a room at the Hilton Hotel. The rationale behind this decision was that Jimmy would work from his hotel room and subsequently contact the school office to inform them that Molly was indisposed. This course of action was deemed acceptable. Jimmy proceeded to contact his acquaintance, Jack Wilson, the city's district attorney, to provide him with a concise account of the situation. He informed Jack that his wife was likely to file a missing person report within the next 24 hours and requested that he delay this action until further notice, given that Molly was in Jimmy's care and would be returning shortly. Contact will be made shortly. Linda, Jack reluctantly agreed but informed Jimmy that he could only postpone this until Monday. Therefore, Jimmy should speak with Linda before then. Molly and Jimmy checked into the Hilton Hotel and ordered hamburgers and fries. They then turned on the TV, lay down in their beds, and watched TV until sleep finally claimed them, at least for a few hours. Linda woke up around 10 p.m. She observed that neither Molly nor Jimmy had contacted her. This led her to conclude that Jimmy must be aware of the situation, as he would have done so by now had he wanted to. She attempted to call Jimmy and Molly again, but her calls went straight to voicemail, indicating that their phones were disconnected. She wrote to Jimmy, expressing her feelings and apologizing for her behavior. She also stated that she loved him and that he should let her know if he wanted to talk. She also mentioned Molly. She implored him to come home and discuss the matter further. She was uncertain as to how Jimmy would respond, but she hoped he would understand her perspective. Would he want to know the details? Would it be preferable to address the issue in a single conversation, rather than dwelling on it? She contemplated her narrative and the explanation she would provide. She waited until midnight for a reply, but when there was no response, she retired for the night, her mind restless and her sleep elusive. She experienced feelings of hatred for her actions and the pain she had caused. In the morning, Jimmy and Molly woke up early and went to the Hilton for breakfast. Jimmy called the school and informed them that Molly would be home for 2 days. He also called his work and requested to work from home on his cell phone and on his computer if necessary. He asked that they only call him for urgent matters. He then looked at Molly and apologized for what she had seen and for involving her in the situation. This unfortunate turn of events finds you entering adulthood at a relatively early age, with the challenges that life can present arriving sooner than anticipated. At the age of 15, you are now in a position to perceive the significance of the values I have previously discussed, namely loyalty, honesty, and truthfulness. It is crucial to adhere to your moral and ethical principles. While life may present challenges and difficulties, it is essential to strive to align your actions with your personal code of conduct. She disregarded the aforementioned code of conduct, which resulted in the loss of trust and deception. I will consider the appropriate course of action and, given your involvement in this matter, I will allow you to accompany me at every stage and assist in determining the fate of our family. I will contact Dan immediately to ascertain the situation. Jimmy proceeded to dial Dan's number, and Dan answered. To disturb Amanda, who had just emerged from bed, he descended the stairs and proceeded to the porch, where he inquired about the situation. Jimmy's frustration intensified as he demanded clarification. He urged Dan to provide a detailed account of the events in question, emphasizing the importance of honesty and clarity. It was not about you, Jimmy. It was not that we were in love or even that interested in each other. It was purely sexual. It was just physical relief and an instant feeling of lust and excitement. I am sorry, Jimmy, but it did not really mean anything to either of us. Jimmy, have you spoken to Linda? I think you should ask her these questions. I am asking you, Jimmy. How long has this been going on? Jimmy, Dan said it's not about you. It just happened. I was not getting sufficient sexual intimacy with Amanda, who was pregnant. I was experiencing heightened sexual desire and attraction to Linda. I initiated contact with her and ultimately engaged in sexual activity with her. The circumstances led to a physical encounter. I am genuinely remorseful. I ask for your forgiveness and believe we can overcome this challenge. Jimmy, I want you to know that both of us care for you deeply and are committed to protecting your well-being and your family. I ask for your forgiveness, Dan. This is how the relationship between the two men will be from now on. There will be no further communication or contact between them. If they encounter each other, they should avoid any confrontation. The relationship is effectively over. Dan attempted to make amends and asked Jimmy to be reasonable. However, Jimmy was adamant that the relationship could not be salvaged. He maintained that the incident was merely physical and did not signify a deeper emotional connection. Dan, however, was adamant that the incident had caused irreparable damage to the relationship. He also expressed his regret for the impact it had on Molly. Jimmy was similarly distressed by the incident and its consequences. He was also concerned about the effect it had on Molly. Tell me that this does not signify anything. This indicates that none of you demonstrated sufficient respect or love for us to avoid causing us the most profound distress. Jimmy terminated the call and resolved that this would be the final time he would converse with Dan. Molly and Jimmy spent Thursday and Friday working in the hotel room, dining at the restaurant, and then venturing outside to obtain some fresh air. Linda persisted in contacting them, but neither responded or even listened to the voicemail messages. Linda was deeply concerned and uncertain about the best course of action. To contact them, she also called Dan, but he did not respond to any of her calls. She finally went to the police station on Friday afternoon to file a missing person report. My daughter has run away, and I am seeking assistance in locating her. The officer on duty began to collect information from her, including her name, daughter's name, husband's name, and address. He then requested to wait a few minutes while he went into the office. In a brief interval, Jack Wilson, the district attorney, emerged and introduced himself. He then escorted Linda to the interrogation room and requested that she take a seat. "Mrs. Jacobs, I am a friend of your husband, Jimmy. I wish to inform you that Molly is safe and well. She is currently with Jimmy, who contacted me to relay that you might be planning to file a missing persons report. I have an agreement with him that I will provide him with an opportunity to contact you before taking any action regarding the missing person." The individual filed a missing person report, indicating that Molly was in his company and that they were both safe. This was the extent of the information he was willing to divulge at that time. He promised to contact her again and, if he did not, she was instructed to contact the police. He then handed her his business card and led her to the exit. As she left, she was acutely aware of his gaze and the lack of respect he showed her. She surmised that Jimmy had informed him of the situation and that she would be wasting her time trying to argue with him. Jimmy had a great many friends and they had his back. She proceeded to the vehicle, entered it, and began to weep once more. At the Hilton, Jimmy regarded Molly and stated, "I believe we should at least converse with your mother and inform her of your well-being. Would you like to speak with her?" "No," Molly replied. "I do not intend to communicate with her ever again. I am unable to identify any rationale for accepting her actions. I cannot envision an apology that would be satisfactory. How can you be certain she is being truthful? How can you trust her again?" "Molly, the family is currently experiencing a range of intense emotions, including shock and betrayal. However, with time, these feelings will subside, and the family will have to decide whether to move forward or attempt to repair the damage caused by the infidelity. One potential course of action would be to drive up to the house and give the individual involved an opportunity to be truthful about the affair. Following this, the family could decide that they require additional clothing and toiletries if they intend to stay in a hotel. Additionally, the individual who was previously in school will need to resume their studies on Monday. Therefore, they should prepare their backpack and books for the upcoming week. Given that it is Sunday, we should proceed to the house and afford her the opportunity to recount her version of events. Following this, we will determine whether to remain or retrieve our belongings and depart. It is our obligation to provide her with an opportunity to be truthful and elucidate the circumstances surrounding the affair." Molly and Jimmy proceeded to the house and entered through the front door. The interior was devoid of illumination, save for the kitchen. They entered the kitchen, where Linda was seated, consuming coffee and gazing into her cup. Her demeanor suggested the woman had aged significantly in the interim. Her face was swollen and reddened, her eye makeup partially washed away by her tears. She had not replaced it or removed it. "My hair was unkempt and unwashed." When she looked up and saw them, she immediately jumped out of her chair and tried to run to Molly and hug her. Molly raised her arms and pushed her away, then walked around to the other side, avoiding contact with her mother. Jimmy did the same. "We have returned to discuss your actions and the rationale behind them. Your actions have caused us significant distress, resulting in the loss of our love and trust in you. It is unclear whether there is a possibility of achieving closure regarding the events that Molly witnessed and recorded on video. I am willing to provide an opportunity for me to present my perspective." Linda was observed to be crying and her nose was running. She proceeded to retrieve a tissue and wipe her nose. Her eyes were red from crying, and she looked at them both. "I'm really sorry. Please know that this has nothing to do with either of you. I love you both more than life itself, and I don't want to lose you. Jimmy, it was just sex. It didn't mean anything. This was the first and only time this happened, and it will never happen again. We can get through this. Don't leave our marriage because of a one-time mistake." After uttering this falsehood, she turned away. Upon glancing back, she observed that Jimmy was on the brink of an explosive outburst. Jimmy then stated, "I believe we should proceed with Plan B." Molly promptly departed the kitchen and proceeded to her room, where she began packing her belongings and personal items, along with her backpack. Once Molly had left the room, Jimmy turned to Linda and loudly proclaimed, "So, you intend to exploit the situation to its fullest extent." The standard, __, lines were employed instead of disclosing the truth. The sexual encounter was devoid of any meaningful emotional connection. Furthermore, the assertion that this was the first and only instance of such behavior is indicative of a pattern of deceit and dishonesty. A discussion with Dan revealed that this pattern has been ongoing for approximately 10 weeks. Additionally, a video recording of the subject engaging in sexual intercourse with Dan while humiliating me was brought to my attention. The question thus arises as to which of the two parties is lying. It is evident that the answer lies with you. Furthermore, it is clear that any attempt at establishing the truth or attaining understanding through further discussion with you will be futile. I have already informed Dan that I consider our relationship to be irretrievably broken and that I will never see or speak to him again. This is a decision that I am currently struggling to implement in my relationship with you. However, I am determined to pursue this course of action. It is not sufficient to claim that our marriage is irreparably damaged by a single mistake. This was not a single mistake, it was an ongoing affair. You would not have ceased your illicit activities had Molly not entered the room. It is evident that your primary concern is avoiding detection. You have betrayed and disrespected your family by engaging in an adulterous relationship with Dan. This has also caused significant distress to my brother. Therefore, it is inaccurate to claim that I am abandoning the institution of marriage. You initiated the breakdown of your marriage by initiating an emotional and then sexual relationship with Dan. At what age do you believe it is appropriate for a child to engage in such activities? 1 year the daughter will be able to cope with what she saw. Jimmy turned and ran upstairs to the bedroom. Linda collapsed on the floor sobbing. She thought she could help her case by lying about how long the affair lasted and trying to tell him that it was pointless and he should forgive her. She had never seen him so enraged. Now she wondered if there was even a chance of reconciliation with her husband and daughter. She was shocked by the pain and anger caused by her betrayal was evident on their faces a few minutes later. Molly and Jimmy came downstairs with their belongings. Jimmy removed his wedding ring and placed it on the counter. They departed in silence. Linda was left lying on the kitchen floor, curled up in a ball and crying. Jimmy and Molly returned to the Hilton, but Jimmy began looking at apartments that were close to the school and not too far from his office. He called several rental agencies and by the end of the day, he had secured a 6-month lease on a fairly new, 2-bedroom, 2-bath apartment with a landscaped pool, spa, barbecue grills, and tables, and a gym. Jimmy leased a 2-bedroom, 2-bath apartment with a landscaped pool and spa, barbecue grills, tables, and a gym for a 6-month term. The following morning, he accompanied Molly to school, returned, and relocated their modest wardrobe and belongings into the apartment. Jimmy promptly commenced work, contacting his financial advisors and initiating the division of his pre-tax savings checks and joint accounts into one account in his name and another in Linda's name. He then scheduled an appointment with a reputable divorce lawyer for that afternoon. He then proceeded to consolidate his tax savings, checking, and joint accounts into a single account in his name and another account in Linda's name. He subsequently made an appointment with a reputable divorce lawyer, known for his excellent reputation, for that afternoon. His planner subsequently contacted him and informed him that, given that he had set up college funds for his daughter, he could take a significant portion of his joint. He then proceeded to transfer the majority of his savings and investment accounts into a trust, with the objective of funding his daughter's college education. Additionally, he amended his insurance beneficiary designation to Molly. Following a 10-day period, the divorce strategy and all associated financial adjustments were finalized. He then instructed his lawyer to commence the filing of divorce papers, which were only filed upon receiving communication from Jimmy over the past 10 days. She had been contacting Molly and Jimmy repeatedly, imploring them to communicate, to engage in marriage counseling, and to return home. Jimmy instructed the security personnel at his office to deny her access to the premises. Molly visited the school's vice principal to convey the circumstances and persuade him that Linda should be prohibited from entering the school grounds. At this juncture, Molly received a communication from Linda's parents. Molly's parents called her and left a voicemail, which confused her. The message essentially conveyed that they were uncertain about the rationale behind Molly and Jimmy's treatment of their daughter in the wake of a seemingly minor disagreement. It also questioned the parents' decision to abruptly end communication without attempting to resolve the issue. Molly then contacted Jimmy's parents to inquire if they had received any updates. She initiated a conversation by greeting them and inquiring about their well-being. Contact with the family and updates. I am aware that we have not seen each other for several weeks. They informed me that there was no new information. They were simply waiting for Dan and Amanda's baby to be born. They said Dan and Amanda were coming over for brunch the following weekend and asked if Linda, Jimmy, and Molly would like to come. Molly quickly realized that no one in the family was aware of the situation. It would appear that Linda did not divulge the full truth to her parents, and that Dan did not discuss the matter with his own parents or Amanda. That same evening, Jimmy received a call from Linda's sister, Sherry, who reprimanded him for taking Molly and leaving Linda for what she considered to be a trivial reason, namely a disagreement about Molly's schoolwork. "How could you be so unkind?" Sherry asked. "This does not sound like you at all, Jimmy." He simply stated that there were personal issues between him and Linda that would require time to resolve. 20 minutes after this call, Linda's parents called with the same message. They questioned his decision to leave because of minor disputes and disagreements. At the end of the evening, Jimmy's parents called and asked if Linda, Jimmy, and Dan would come over for brunch. Molly observed that Jimmy was in an effort to circumvent accusations. Neither Linda nor Dan divulged the actual circumstances to their family. Molly observed that neither of them had provided an accurate account of events, and she attributed this to their failure to communicate effectively. Her father, however, remained unconcerned, suggesting that the situation would eventually resolve itself. He was engaged in a period of introspection, reflection and conversations with Molly. Jimmy concluded that his love for Linda, the pain of being betrayed, the deception, and her unwillingness to admit that she had not kept her wedding vows were too significant to forgive. Additionally, it was evident that she did not take responsibility for her actions towards her family. Similarly, Dan reached the same conclusion and requested that his legal counsel serve Linda with divorce papers. Linda, meanwhile, was contemplating the most effective strategy for reuniting with Jimmy and Molly. Despite her awareness of having caused them pain, she attempted to persuade herself that her actions were inconsequential. She told herself that the sexual intimacy was meaningless and that the relationship was over. She believed that her former partners would miss her and come back, and that when they returned, she would be the most loving wife and mother she could be. While she was pondering how to get Jimmy to communicate with her, she heard a car pull up. A few moments later, there was a knock on the door. A knock on the door prompted Linda Jacobs to look out the window, where she observed a young man in a suit. She opened the door and was greeted by the man, who inquired as to whether she was the intended recipient. Jacobs confirmed her identity and the man proceeded to present her with an 8.5 x 11-inch folder, stating, "Mrs. Jacobs, you have been served." He then promptly departed. A photograph of her with the package was presented, and then the man turned and walked back to his vehicle. It appeared that Linda had not informed her parents of the truth, and it was evident that Dan had not discussed the matter with Amanda or his parents that same evening. Jimmy received a telephone call from Linda's sister, Sherry, who reprimanded him for taking Molly and leaving Linda, for what seems to be a relatively minor disagreement regarding Molly and her friend's schoolwork. "How could you be so cruel, Jimmy? This does not seem to align with your character." Jimmy simply stated that there were personal issues between him and Linda that would require time to resolve. 20 minutes after this call, Linda's parents called with the same message was conveyed. How could one be so cruel as to leave because of some minor disputes and disagreements? At the end of the evening, Jimmy's parents called and inquired as to whether Linda, Jimmy, and Dan would come over for brunch. Molly observed that Jimmy was attempting to evade accusations, yet neither Linda nor Dan would divulge the truth to anyone. Molly then informed him that it was evident that neither Linda nor Dan had conveyed the complete truth to their family. She then proceeded to place the blame on him, expressing her displeasure. However, her father remained indifferent, stating that the situation would eventually resolve itself. An investigation into the self was initiated. Reflection and conversations with Molly. Jimmy concluded that his love for Linda, the pain of being betrayed, the deception, and the unwillingness to admit that she had not kept her wedding vows were all factors that made it difficult for him to forgive. Additionally, it was evident that she did not take responsibility for her actions with regard to her family, and Dan did not either. As a result, Jimmy decided the situation was concluded, and Linda's legal counsel were instructed to serve her with divorce papers. Linda was at home, contemplating a course of action to facilitate the return of Jimmy and Molly, with a view to repairing her relationship with them. She was aware that she had caused them pain, but attempted to persuade herself that the relationship was at an end and could be restored to its former state. She told herself that they would miss her in return, and that when they did, she would be a devoted wife and mother. While pondering how to initiate communication with Jimmy, she heard a vehicle arrive and shortly afterwards, a knock on the door. The door was opened by Linda Jacobs, who looked out of the window and saw a young man in a suit looking at her. She opened the door and the young man inquired as to whether she was Linda Jacobs. Jacobs replied in the affirmative, and the young man handed her an 8.5 by 11-inch folder and said, "Mrs. Jacobs, you have been served." He then proceeded to take a photograph of her with the package, before turning and walking back to his vehicle. Linda was unable to comprehend the nature of his conversation, and thus proceeded to enter the living room and take a seat on the sofa. She then proceeded to open the envelope, from which she extracted the documents. Upon doing so, she observed that the first page of the documents was a petition for divorce. This information prompted her to experience a profound emotional response. With tears, she dropped the documents and, for the first time, truly realized that she had abandoned her marriage and family for a few days. Shortly thereafter, Jimmy began receiving calls from all directions. Both Linda's parents and his parents accused him of divorcing his wife over minor differences and arguments. Then, Dan's wife, Amanda, called and scolded him. She asked how he could stop talking to Dan because of arguments over tools and how he could think about divorcing Linda for such trivial reasons. She suggested that he might need help. Jimmy attempted to ignore these calls. Despite his insistence that this was a private matter between Linda, Molly, and himself, and that they should inquire with Linda to ascertain her intentions regarding reconciliation and the potential for divorce, his efforts proved ineffective. They began contacting him frequently, and then they initiated similar communications with Molly, attempting to convince her to return home and reconcile with her mother, who was profoundly distressed. Molly observed the immense distress this caused Jimmy and how the entire family now portrayed him as the primary source of conflict. She recognized that Dan had not disclosed this information to anyone. The veracity of the situation was that the difficulties he was experiencing with Jimmy were a direct result of the loss of some of Jimmy's tools. Molly observed that Linda was attempting to mobilize the collective resources of the family in order to persuade Jimmy and Molly to return. She never disclosed the truth or provided them with the complete narrative. She was aware that Jimmy was too principled to disseminate information that was not entirely accurate. Molly was compelled to reveal the truth, which would irreparably damage the relationship between Linda and Dan and their wider family. She drafted an email to the entire family, expressing her frustration at the tendency to blame her father for the difficulties between her mother and her, as well as between Dan and her father. I am compelled to forward the attached video, which I recognize may elicit a strong emotional response. When I initially encountered this situation, I was similarly taken aback and distressed. It is deeply unjust that Jimmy should be subjected to retribution by his family for actions he did not commit. He has been betrayed by his wife, brother, and now his own family. It would be beneficial to consider the situation from the perspective of my father. What would you do if you were in his position? How would you react if two individuals who you had assumed would provide you with protection and support, and who you believed would always be on your side, were to betray you in such a profound manner and continue to provide false information about the incident? She did not assume responsibility for her actions. Please view the attached video in the privacy of your own home and then engage in a discussion with my mother and Uncle Dan about how my father should have reacted. She copied the addresses of the entire family, including her father, whom she knew would react irrationally, but she felt obliged to support him and Linda and Dan. She then clicked the submit button. Linda was at work and did not see her personal email. Furthermore, her phone was turned off when she walked out into the parking lot and into her car at the end of the day. She then turned on her phone in the hope of seeing some kind of response from Jimmy to her daily calls, in which she begged him to she sought forgiveness and implored him to allow her an opportunity to clarify her actions. She hoped he would reconsider his decision to leave and engage in dialogue. She observed unanswered calls from her parents, Amanda, and Jimmy's parents. She listened to the voicemail from Amanda, which was laced with disdain. The message asserted that she was a disgraceful woman and had irreparably damaged Jimmy's life through her illicit affair. Furthermore, your actions have negatively impacted my life as well. I have no intention of communicating with you again and will serve as Jimmy's most compelling witness in the divorce proceedings. He treated you with respect and love and was devoted to his family, yet you undermined these values with your unscrupulous actions. It is possible that Dan may choose to stay with you, but his departure from the premises was imminent. Linda was uncertain as to whether Dan had divulged the truth or not, but she sensed that the family was aware of the reality of the situation. The subsequent voicemail was from her mother. "How could you?" it began. It was so distasteful and distressing to observe this. Video and audio evidence of Jimmy and Linda in a sexual act in the marital bed. Molly then enters the scene and witnesses her father's betrayal by her mother and uncle. The emotional impact of this betrayal is profound, leading Linda to become the primary emotional driver of the situation and to begin crying. She then accesses her email on her iPhone and views a letter from Molly. She was reluctant to view the video, as she was fairly certain of its contents. However, she did so to gain insight into the perspective of the rest of the family. The explicit sexual acts were not the only disturbing aspect. She also heard Dan's voice, clearly audible, uttering phrases such as, "Me you dirty boy," and "Don't stop." She screamed, and Dan replied, "I love sex with you and I'll have you better than little Jimmy ever did." Furthermore, the couple laughed together and shared a cruel joke. Additionally, Molly expressed pain, shock, and rage as she screamed, "You're a cheating, ___________. How could you do this to us? Our family and you, Uncle Dan. I despise you both. You are both reprehensible individuals." Linda was aware that her attempts to enlist the support of her family and to persuade Jimmy to reconsider his actions were futile. She was left with no choice but to confront the truth. What was she thinking? More lies, more disrespect, and an unwillingness to admit her mistakes. To acknowledge that their actions may have been as problematic as the illicit relationship itself, she recognized that she had been deceiving herself with Jimmy's presence. There was no turning back, he was too offended to allow it. She came to understand that she had irreversibly lost any close and loving connection with her daughter. She was no longer entitled to act in the capacity of a parent towards her daughter. Any advice or guidance she offered would be perceived as hypocritical. She wept for an hour in the parking lot before she was able to start the car and drive home. 3 weeks later, Jimmy's lawyer contacted her to inform her that the divorce papers had not been signed or returned. He scheduled a court hearing in 2 weeks. He suggested that she hire a lawyer and prepare. Linda consulted with a divorce lawyer, as recommended by a friend who had been through a similar experience. She was forthcoming with the lawyer about her relationship with Dan and the circumstances that led to their separation. After a thorough examination of the pertinent documents, the lawyer informed her that her husband's inclination towards equitable distribution is commendable. It is evident that he is not attempting to deprive her of financial resources or inflict emotional distress by disclosing the video, with the exception of one particular aspect. He is seeking sole custody of their daughter, a request that is seldom granted by the court. The judge ruled that the divorce petition should be denied in its entirety. The custody of the daughter was granted to the father. The couple appeared in court for the first time since the divorce proceedings began. They had not seen each other for 8 weeks. The children appeared rested and matured beyond their years, as Linda remembered them. Neither child acknowledged her presence. Notably, neither Molly nor Jimmy even acknowledged her presence in the hallway, merely turning away and continuing on their way. I extend my sincerest apologies for this unfortunate turn of events. I am aware that my actions may not warrant forgiveness, yet I am unable to bear the thought of your prolonged animosity. I implore you to consider the possibility of a reconciled relationship. I would be most grateful if you would consider these words. The proceedings commenced in the courtroom when the parties reached the 100% custody issue. At that juncture, the judge indicated a reluctance to make a standard 50-50 decision. Jimmy's counsel then directed his attention to Molly and addressed the judge, stating, "Before you finally decide on my client's behalf." The daughter requested that I visit and speak with the judge promptly. The judge replied that this was highly unusual but, given her age, he would allow it. Molly advanced and both lawyers also proceeded to the bench to listen. "Please, Your Honor," Molly turned to the judge and stated, "I do not wish to reside with my mother because she has caused the irreparable damage to our relationship that would result from an award of custody is such that I would be forced to flee. I would not even consider staying at my mother's house for one night. I ask that you view this video and recognize that it depicts a situation that I have experienced firsthand. The man in the video is the uncle, my father's brother, has been engaging in this behavior for 3 months. It is likely that the situation would not have escalated to this point if not for the discovery of these incriminating words." She proceeded to play the video for the judge, who was visibly affected by its content. He returned the phone and instructed everyone to resume their seats. He then announced that he would be awarding the father sole custody, as requested. Consequently, there would be no child support from my father. Given his salary, I will not require my mother to pay child support with respect to custody. However, I intend to establish that the mother receives a weekly $2 the initial 6-month period will be dedicated to counseling sessions, which will be financed by the father. He is invited to attend, though his presence is not mandatory. The objective of this consultation is to ascertain the potential for a beneficial relationship between mother and daughter for their future well-being. With these words, the judge adjourned the proceedings, and the attendees rose from their seats and departed the courtroom. Linda leaned over the table and wept when she heard the judge granted Jimmy 100% custody of Molly. However, Molly had a glimmer of hope that with the help of a psychologist, she could begin a relationship with her mother. This was all she expected in life, and she desperately wanted to ensure that her daughter knew that her mother loved her. Linda wanted Molly to understand that she had not only hurt Molly, Jimmy, and the entire family, but she had also ruined Molly's life. The destruction affected everyone. Perhaps the greatest pain caused by Linda's affair was to herself. 1 year later, consultations with Linda and Molly proceeded well. Linda was able to better understand her own actions, and Molly could see that Linda was in as much or perhaps even more pain than Jimmy. However, this did not mean that Molly could forgive or justify her mother's actions. She began to occasionally spend weekends at Linda's apartment, and Linda learned to treat Molly like an adult, allow her to make her own decisions, and refrain from criticizing her for these decisions. Linda continued to apologize until one day, Molly instructed her to simply leave the matter behind and never discuss it again. Linda attempted to obtain any information she could about Jimmy, including his appearance, whether he was dating anyone, and whether he seemed happy. Molly observed that Linda loved him deeply but recognized that Jimmy would never reciprocate her feelings. Molly never encouraged her mother to become fixated on Jimmy, but instead advised her to pursue new romantic interests and embark on a fresh chapter in life. Jimmy did not attend any counseling sessions. He was able to reconcile with his parents and foster a close relationship with Amanda and her children. She terminated her relationship with Dan and was in the process of rebuilding her life. In accordance with his promise, Jimmy did not respond to any of Dan's or his parents' attempts to communicate with him. Jimmy was urged to make peace with Dan. If Dan was attending a holiday party or event with his parents, Jimmy did not attend. Jimmy had not spoken to or seen Dan in a year and was content with his decision to never see or talk to Dan again. The previous year, Jimmy devoted himself entirely to his relationship with Molly. His primary focus was on their relationship, and he placed little importance on socializing with other men. Molly encouraged him to start a new life and date, and she believed that he might be ready to move on from his previous relationship. To resume her pursuit of romantic relationships, Linda reflected on her recent experiences and expressed remorse for her actions. She had engaged in a 10-week affair characterized by meaningless sexual encounters. While the experience was initially exhilarating, it ultimately resulted in significant personal and relational turmoil. The guilt and pain she caused through her actions lingered, affecting her sense of self-worth and her perception of her life as a whole. She recognized that her actions had profound consequences, yet she had been too hasty to consider the implications of her actions. The pursuit of illicit sexual gratification led her to forsake the most optimal circumstances she could have hoped for. She initiated a confrontation with her daughter at an early stage, disclosing the reality of the challenges and difficulties that accompany adulthood. In doing so, she renounced the love, trust, partnership, and joy that had previously characterized her family life. Subscribe to our channel to ensure that your subsequent partner does not engage in infidelity, and proceed to listen to the next story, which will present a more compelling account than this one.